Corinthians 11 right away, but someone after class on Sunday asked if we could go back and revisit a verse in chapter 10, and it's really verses 29 and 30, in the context of course, eating things bought in the marketplace, such things as that. Verse 28, if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's, and all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. Okay, the question more or less in a nutshell is verse 30. If I partake with thanks. And I believe the question was more or less, he said, if eating meat causes my brother to stumble, I'm not going to eat meat. I'm not going to do that. So why would he ever be in a situation where, more or less, of partaking with thanks? If I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? He said, I'm going to abstain. And then he says, but if I don't abstain, why are you talking evil about me? Other versions might, and I already checked with Brace, the ESV on verse 30 is, why am I denounced? New American Standard might be something else. What is it? Slandered. I like that one. So you get the idea. So is Paul eating or not? Go ahead, Brace.
I think when he says, I'll never eat meat again if it causes my brother to stumble, he's dealing hypothetically. I mean, if that were the situation, that to cause my brother to stumble would happen by me eating meat, I'll be willing to give it up forever. But he doesn't believe he has to do that necessarily, and doesn't believe they have to do that necessarily, because there are instances where it's perfectly acceptable to eat meat. It's only in those instances where brethren might be caused to stumble by seeing it that would be an issue. And so, I mean, are there instances where he might eat meat or someone else might eat meat not knowing that there was a brother who saw them? In which case they're being denounced or ridiculed or slandered because they're eating meat that had been sacrificed to an idol, but they've eaten it with thanksgiving. And so, I mean, in that instance, they're not doing anything wrong. They've tried to abide by the principle of observing liberties on the basis of their brethren's conscience, but you can't always know who's watching. And I don't think Paul is suggesting that because you can't know who's watching, you never eat meat again. I don't think he's suggesting that at all. And I don't even believe he's suggesting he would do that. He would if it's necessary. In other words, if he had to, he would do it. But I don't believe he sees that as the necessary application or conclusion of this or any liberty, that you just forfeit it altogether, that there's never an instance where it's okay.
You might think about, because we have two parties, right? You have the person who says they can eat, and you have the person who says they cannot eat.
Right.
And both have to be done in faith, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the person who, look back in chapter 8. Look back in chapter 8. You know, all through it as it talks about knowledge, right? How the chapter begins, verse 1. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, right? Of course, he's going to go on to say, well, not everybody has that knowledge. But that knowledge that meat sacrificed to an idol is nothing, where does that knowledge come from? Everything has to be done in faith. So where does that knowledge come from? It's got to come by the Lord's direction, right? I mean, the Lord, right? In this idea. It's the concept, and that's what Paul's doing. Paul's teaching and preaching on the subject, and he says the earth is the Lord's in all its fullness. What does that mean now? It's acceptable. Now, does everybody understand that? No. But that's the basis, right? That's the basis. Not everybody understands that, but that's the basis. The earth is the Lord's in all its fullness. So those who do eat, what are they eating it based on? Based on that. Okay, now those who don't eat, also they have to be doing that in faith. Now, what is that based on? Just think about if you're a Jew and you see one of your Gentile brethren and they're partaking of the meat that was sacrificed to idols. How are you going to feel about that? Let me back up. I'll give you another example. I'll give you an example of where someone, I have to be careful how I phrase this. When the Lord told Peter, rise, Peter, kill and eat. There are all sorts of four-footed things in there, clean and unclean. And what's Peter say? Not so, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. Now, what's the Lord say? Okay, that's your conscience, you don't have to eat. That's not what the Lord says. What's the Lord say? Don't call what I have cleansed unclean. She comes down 3 times. Rise, Peter, kill and eat. And of course, we know the bigger context. And this is where, to be careful how I phrase this. If Peter would have eaten those things right then, would he have been violating his own conscience? And yet, what's the Lord tell him to do? Now, does that mean Paul is going around telling Gentile or Jewish brethren, one way or the other, get up, kill, and eat? No. But I think there has to be some recognition, whether you do or you don't do. You have to do either one in faith. And therefore, that faith has to somehow come from the Word of God. Now, that may come from not understanding that we're not under the Old Covenant and that we're under the New Covenant now, but there's still some basis there. It's not just we're going to do what we want to do. That's not faith. That's not faith. So here, as you think about it, okay, it has to be done in faith. I think there also has to be. Is there any question? What is Paul's view on the matter? Is there any question about that? Well, thank you. I'm trying up here.
No, there's no doubt.
There's no doubt Paul's view, and he has expounded on it and made it abundantly clear. And that's the truth on the matter. Now, those who do not fully understand what Paul understands, do they at least know Paul's view on the matter? Yes. And therefore, can they respect Paul's view on the matter? Right? This is Paul's view on the matter. I may not fully be there, but I know that's his view. And there has to be some recognition there. And therefore, you don't judge him. You don't denounce him. You don't slander him. You recognize, okay, this is a liberty. Paul says this is a liberty. I'm not sure I fully understand that's a liberty, but this is what the Word says. This is what has been revealed, and I'm not going to slander my brethren in these matters. Ultimately, what is the only thing that gets judged? There's only one thing. Sin. And if it's not sinful, then what do? You don't judge it, right? Go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say I think the only place where it would be wrong for Paul is if he was acting the way that Peter did. And when Paul, of course, confronted him, it's a hypocritical thing.
Right.
It was hypocrisy, the way he was acting with one. Now, Paul says, I act like one way with one group of people, and I do something else with a different group of people, but it wasn't because of how he believed or how he wanted them to perceive him. But if you've got hearsay, you've got somebody, if Paul's in Ephesus or Sardinia or one of the other places he's traveled through, and somebody says, oh, I saw Paul eating meat from the temple at that place, then it's hearsay, or it's, and it becomes one of those where it's people not understanding that Paul, not understanding how he sees, how he views it, how has judged this matter.
Yeah. Well, look back at the context of the passage, right? You have a situation where an unbeliever invites you into their home. Where does it say that? Yeah, verse 27. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, So it's an unbeliever. And you have a situation where, okay, if you're a pagan and you eat meat like this, who are you going to be praying to if you're a pagan? Right? Aphrodite, Apollo's one of those. Paul says, okay, you're sitting here across the table, you're sitting here beside me, and who am I praying to? I'm praying to God. I get right. If I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of? Why are you slandering me when I'm praying to Jehovah? I'm not praying to Aphrodite. I'm not praying to Apollos. I'm thankful to the Lord for my food. So if you have this issue, and there has to be both parties, the weak brother and the strong brother, both have to consider one another. Now, that may be more difficult, frankly, for the weaker brother to consider the stronger brother because they don't understand it. But both parties have to consider one another and have to respect its liberty. Otherwise, you're going to end up binding what God has not bound, and then they're going to defy you. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe you just addressed part of this, but I do not understand verse 29. There's so much here about restricting our own liberties to respect other people's consciences. And then verse 29 seems to say, I don't have to do that. And I don't understand how the question in verse 29 fits with everything else here.
Okay, conscience, I say, you read out the New American Standard? Read it for us, will you, Becky, since, Chuck just moved the microphone away.
For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? And everything else here seems to say respect other people's conscience, but that question does not.
Okay, for one thing, that word determined there, it is the word for judged. So we are talking about why is my liberty, right? Because that's ultimately what we're talking about. This is a liberty. Why is my liberty why is my liberty where I can do one or the other, and someone is determining that I've sinned, right? Why is my liberty being determined by another man's conscience in this matter? And that's the judging that's going on. And they have to respect one another. I think there has to be some amount of knowledge there. And I don't think both have the same amount of knowledge, but there has to be some amount for both parties to understand this is a liberty. There has to be some amount. And if they didn't understand it before, surely they understand it now as Paul's writing to them, that the earth and all its fullness belongs to the Lord. Go ahead, Mr. Warren.
I was just going to say that I appreciate you using the reference with the sheet coming down with the animals that were unclean represented something else, and also you saying that so the food and the animals are theories that are not limited to food and animals. They apply. So I appreciate you saying
it's really
that.
Not about animals at all.
It's really not.
It's about Gentiles.
It could be, but it's not excluded. But
right.
I appreciate saying that.
Yeah, that we're talking about concepts. Really loud tonight. Anyway, does anyone have any other questions or comments or about that passage? It's all about esteeming others better than yourself. Ultimately.
To Becky's question, I don't know if this is the answer, but is it possible that we're dealing with two sides of the same coin? Kind of like what you've been talking about here toward the end of class. From my perspective, I need to be willing to give up my liberty for the sake of another person's conscience. But from the sake of a brother...
Pause right there just for a second.
Go ahead.
Because a liberty is, you can go either way.
Correct.
So it's not really like you're giving up, you're just choosing the different path, right?
So, but I'm choosing to abstain from
Yes.
exercising the liberty.
Yes.
For the benefit of my brother's conscience.
Right.
But from their perspective, and maybe that's what verse 30 is primarily dealing with, I agree with Becky. Verse 29 is still hard because it seems to be tied to this conversation that's about the unbeliever. In verse 30, I can make the jump a little easier to dealing with the flip side of a brother's view, a weak brother's view toward me, in that they should not denounce me for something that is not clearly sinful, but may in fact be a matter of liberty or judgment. But in verse 29, I mean, Becky's right. There's still the difficulty in that it seems to be linked in context with the unbeliever. The only thing I'll say is that the grammatical notation was not in the original, and it makes it sometimes difficult for translators to know how best to piece sentences and paragraphs together. So there may be something with the English construction of the sentence that makes it difficult for us, possibly.
I wonder if part of the problem is where they put the verse break.
It's possible.
If the verse break was put in verse 29 after but that of the other, and then put the latter half of verse 29 and verse 30 together, for why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience, but if I partake with thanks?
I mean, it's possible.
I wonder
mean,
if that's part of the issue.
That's the only other suggestion that I have that might fit. It doesn't solve the problem, and it doesn't really clear it up for us. And I don't at the moment have an answer for, other than perhaps what you just said, I don't have an answer for how we could reconstruct the sentence in the English and stay true to the Greek in a way that would make it have a little more clarity for us.
I mean, like I said,
So,
my take is I think there has to be some element of knowledge there. Or at least a recognition of the other person's liberty and knowledge on some level. You're dealing with, I hate to, sorry, I keep ranting about it. If you have Gentile Christians, if they, and he says, I don't want you to have, right, fellowship with demons. You better be real careful about that. If you're still thinking that way. But surely they've come a little way. And there just has to be some recognition of the liberty. If there's no recognition of the liberty, then what ends up happening is you end up binding it. Okay? If there's no recognition that circumcision is a liberty, then what are you going to do? You're going to bind circumcision. If there's no recognition that of any of the liberties, you're going to end up binding one way or the other is the issue.
I wonder if ultimately, because I think that Paul is pretty clear here and elsewhere that a liberty is a liberty. And like you said, if you start to constrain it on the basis of people's consciences, well, then it's really not a liberty anymore. So it still has to be a liberty in the person's understanding. The person who knows that something sacrificed to an idol is nothing, they know it's a liberty, and they know that they retain that liberty. But I wonder if maybe when it says the one who, because it's talking about one who does not believe, they invite you to dinner, and when they're setting it before you, they say this was offered to idols. I don't know if maybe that's an indication that to this person, there is a significance to the meat that they're offering. In essence, I'm serving you this meat, in honor of Aphrodite, or this meat is a sacrifice to Aphrodite. And then if you were to partake after them having said that, it could be interpreted by them as you condoning or confirming their error or their idolatrous beliefs. So maybe Paul here is saying, don't confuse people. Don't knowingly rub your liberty in someone's face when you know that it's going to confuse them or bring up more questions than answers, and potentially slow them down in coming to understand the true nature of what sacrifices and what idols actually are. There's, for anyone who's going to learn that, there's a period of adjustment. Nobody flips a switch and just boom, my mind has changed. I immediately agree with everything that I once disagreed with. For pretty much everyone, that takes time. And so there's going to be a period of time where you're going to have to kind of walk on eggshells as you're teaching someone, because maybe not walk on eggshells is the right analogy, but as you're teaching someone, you've got to be conscious of, okay, reaching this level of belief takes time. So I don't know, just some thoughts maybe.
Yeah, I thought they were pretty good. How can I phrase this? If I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? What did people have a problem with Jesus for repeatedly? He ate with sinners. Was the problem the food or was the problem the people? The people. All right. Paul withstands Peter to the face because food was involved in that situation. Was the problem the food or was the problem what was happening with the people? It's people. I wonder if, okay, why is someone slandering Paul? And now we're back to, well, if an unbeliever invites you, and I wonder if it's not some of the same thing. Is the issue the food or is the issue, Paul, who are you eating with? Because we know it's an unbeliever. And I wonder if that might be part of the issue. What is that unbeliever partaking in? Well, they're an unbeliever. So I wonder if that's not part of the slander that was going on. Go ahead, Jim.
It seems the person slandering him must have some knowledge of what Paul should be doing or not doing.
Right. Just for them to slander.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think the slander or the accusation of him becoming accused of this slander is coming from the unbeliever. It's coming from someone who is, I don't know, somebody that doesn't think he has that liberty.
And that's my point. If it's a third party who is seeing him eat with an unbeliever, and it's, whoa, oh, you're having fellowship with sin, like, because that's what they said about Jesus. And it's, no, I'm partaking. Food is just food. And I'm not praying to Aphrodite. I'm praying to the Lord. Anyway. Okay, is the horse dead yet, or should we? All right, y'all ready to talk about something whole lot easier now, the covering? All right, come on to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And you can tell there's some question about where the verse 1 goes, whether it's chapter 10 and verse 11 or chapter 11. Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, that you keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Okay. I kind of took a different approach in the outline for this section, just so I was afraid it was going to get messy if I tried to go through it. There are several different views for this passage. Anyone feel like amening that one? Several different views of the passage. I want you to consider, though, within each view, there may be principles, and I think those principles are the primary thing, rather than just focusing on whether someone is wearing a covering or not wearing a covering. What I'd like for us to see as we go through is to look at some of those principles. So I just listed the views that I know about, like I said, there are probably other views. One view of the passage is it is speaking about a physical covering to be worn today when a woman is praying or worshiping. That's one view. It's more popular down south, but there are folks up here who do it as well. I'm sure you all have seen folks do that in times past. There may have been folks who worshiped here who did that in times past. The second option, it is speaking about a physical covering that was worn then as a custom. The language in verse 6 somewhat lends itself to this idea, right? When it says, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. Well, what would determine if it was shameful? It's going to be the culture. It's going to be the custom. So that verse may give a little credence to that idea. And perhaps the closing sentence points there as well. If culture called for the married to wear a covering, then so be it. But it was not going to be taught as a church custom. If culture dictated it, that's one thing, but it wasn't going to be a doctrine of the church, so to speak. Hopefully, y'all understand what I mean by that. The third option is it is speaking about a physical covering in regards to women who may have had the gifts of the Spirit. This one isn't quite as commonly held, but I have heard of folks who hold it. Because you do have issues like, you remember Philip had how many daughters who prophesied? 3 daughters, or however many daughters, seven daughters that prophesied, however many it was. Now, where are those ladies prophesying at? They're prophesying somewhere. You go all the way back to Acts 2, and as much as, and this is one of the problems. Again, I'm not looking for an amen on this one, especially from the ladies. But ladies, can men sometimes be male chauvinists? Sometimes. And guess what? Back in Acts 2, when on the day of Pentecost, and as you have the Holy Spirit being given, they're speaking in tongues, and they say, oh, these guys are all drunk. Peter says, they are not drunk. This is what was prophesied by Joel. And he says, your men and who? Your men and women, your servants and your maidservants, or however it phrases it. So from Acts 2, we know that the miraculous gifts were not exclusive to the men. Women also had them. Now that makes you ask the question, okay, Philip's daughters who prophesied, others who may have had the same gift. We're not far removed from chapter 14, where it's going to say, over in chapter 14, at verse 34, let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. But you have a situation where they have, and I'm just telling you, this is their view now, those who hold this view. Because you have this verse, and we'll talk more about it as we go along. We know there were women who had the gift of prophecy, and that perhaps because they had the gift, but also out of submission and recognition for these principles, they were to wear a covering. And notice back in the chapter 11, it is when she is doing what? When she is praying or prophesying. Verse 5, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered. So perhaps it is pointing to that situation and dealing with that situation. A fourth view is that the whole thing is speaking more figuratively, that the key to the whole thing is verse 3. What is the head of every man? Christ. And then the head of every woman is man, and then the head of Christ is God. And sometimes what folks do is they will take that, and then they will apply those concepts throughout the entire thing. So every time it talks about her head, it's talking about her husband, and that the whole thing somewhat becomes figurative in a sense, and that it's not talking about a physical covering at all, but it's talking about more spiritual matters. So anyway, those are the 4 views. Does anyone know of any other views before you say, number 1, we're all going to vote when this is over, by the way. Does anyone know of any other views on it? I couldn't really think of any. There are questions and concerns that a person would have. For one thing that I wanted you to think about, the word for covering here, It is the word that means, according to Strong's, to cover the whole head, basically. So that means it is not what? I'm not going to say it. I won't even have Chuck bring the microphone up here. It is not a minimalist piece of cloth on the top of the head. That's not what it was. That's not what, whatever this was, it was not that. It was not a New York Yankees ball cap. It was not a, it was not a fashionable hat. It's not just anything on top of your head and, oh, there, I'm good, I'm churched up. That's not what this was. It covered the entire, it was a veil that covered the entire thing. It was not a minimalistic piece of cloth. The second thing I wanted you to consider, though, is, and this is somewhat of a, is our outward appearance usually what we're supposed to be focusing on? The knee-jerk reaction to that is no. But are we supposed to be worried about our outward appearance? To which question? I can't even remember. I just said it 5 seconds ago. I can't remember what. Right. 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 And that's, to just, and I was just thinking about, because I think a knee-jerk reaction is, I don't care what anybody thinks, I'm going to wear what I want to wear, and they can all go to the devil. And it's, you need to slow down there for a second. And you think about certain places in Scripture. For example, when the Lord is talking about the Pharisees, and he's talking about their fasting, and he says they disfigure their faces. And why are they doing that? Right? To appear religious. And he says, he doesn't condemn fasting. The problem's not the fasting. He says, but when you fast, what do? Wash your face, anoint your head with oil. Effectively, what are you supposed to look like? Normal. Right? You're not trying to draw attention to yourself. You're not looking for the applause of men. That's one account that I wanted you to consider, where he's talking about outward appearance, because that's what the Pharisees were all about, outward appearance. Another one is the parable of the wedding feast, or one of the parables of the wedding, where he comes in and there's a man there, and what is he not wearing? He's not wearing a wedding garment. Now, here's the point. What did that say about the man? He was not being respectful. Okay? He was not prepared. He was not being respectful. And the master says, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? Just hold on, Aaron. I'll get to you in a sec. Hold on. I remember going to church in Illinois. It was in Pekin, actually. Preacher got up that night in a Ricky Williams football jersey. This was after Ricky Williams was busted for dope, by the way. Not before. How do y'all feel about that? Now, I have a feeling some folks are going to be like, it's just a shirt. It's just a shirt. Do appearances matter at all? And here's the problem. Sorry, young people. Sorry. Don't throw tomatoes at me. Young people love to say appearances don't matter at all. And who spends the most money on their appearance?
And looks the same.
And it just you have to admit appearances do matter. Now, what matters more? The inner. And ultimately what it is what is the outward a manifestation of? Usually, unless you're playing the hypocrite, usually the outward, right? He says you guys cleanse the outside of the dish, but the inside is nasty. Instead, what do you ought to do? Cleanse the inside so that you can be clean altogether. That's what you need to do. Another verse that comes to mind is when it's speaking about, it's in Peter's epistle, in talking about wives, be submissive to your own husbands when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart. So, is there a part of that verse that mentions the outer? Yes. Is there a part of that verse that mentions the inner? Yes. Go ahead, Aaron. You've been waiting long enough.
You sort of stole my thunder.
Sorry.
When you said, let's just be realistic, clothing usually has a purpose, and usually those who have good intentions dress in ways that are befitting of those intentions. So like if you look around and you see women with low-cut shirts and short shorts,
Yep.
you know there's something else going on there.
Sure.
Just in general, even though clothing isn't technically the issue, it's always just an outward appearance of what is
Yep.
actually going on inside.
Yep. Okay. So we'll say this, and I'll give you an example to get it closer to what we're talking about, 1 Corinthians 11. I knew a fellow who was doing work in Africa, and they were preaching on 1 Corinthians 11. And all of a sudden, women started coming to church, and they weren't wearing any sort of covering. I can't remember what country it was. But the preacher got wind of the fact that in that culture, if you didn't wear a covering, you were considered a harlot. And you know what he immediately did? You all need to put your covering back on because that's what the culture dictated. Do you somewhat have to respect the culture? Right? If the culture says this is the attire of a harlot, well, if you're going to walk down Main Street without clothing, what are you going to be associated with? Okay, so back to our verse again. If a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, what should she do? Let her be covered. There is some, to look at the outline, most folks, they take the second view that what we're talking about is the customs of the time and customs in Corinth, and that's what this covering pertained to, as every culture has their own practices. Do those cultures change over time? Yes. Andrew, how long ago did you get married? What was it? 3 months? 2 months? 2.5 months. Right? We put on our glad rags. We got all dressed up. We went uptown. And then when did you go to that wedding in Lafayette? 2 weeks later? 2 or 3 weeks later. And it was some family relation. And what were they wearing? I thought it was like casual. Yeah, they wore jeans. It was more casual. Is the culture changing with time? Yes. Is that okay? Yeah. I mean, if it's not a question of modesty and immodesty, if culture changes, there are actually preachers out there that don't wear a suit on Sunday. Oh my goodness. I can't believe it. Go ahead, Ms. Joy.
Translations say, but for me, at my level of understanding, verse 13 solves a lot. This is judge for yourselves. If he's not saying this is wrong, this is right, he's saying judge for yourselves, which can have to do with custom, it can have to do with respect.
And I wonder if some of these ideas, because you are going to have to deal with that issue of the women prophesying. So I wonder if part of that is not at play here. And it's like, okay, how are you going to handle this? Because I only have 6 minutes left. I think Corinth was a very odd city. Because I think even though there was a temple to Apollos, the one that most folks talk about is Aphrodite. And when they talk about the prostitutes that served in that temple, it's not, they were not lower class citizens. They were actually admired. There's actually artistic depictions and things like that. So it was somewhat of a female, a feminine rights society, okay? And I couldn't think of a better way to put that. But hopefully you know what I mean. So I wonder if all of that somewhat goes into play here in Corinth. There's a reason that the verse is going to have to be written later, let your women be silent. Because there is going to be, okay, God wants things done a certain way. But these women have these gifts, so how are they going to be able to express these gifts? And I wonder if that doesn't come into play. But I wonder if it might not necessarily just be one view. There may be different ideas, whether it's culture or whether it's the gifts or whatever the case may be. The tail end of the account when it says we have no such custom, nor do the churches. And it's like, we are not, y'all ought to be glad. I've mellowed with age. I wouldn't guess that. When I've taught on this before in other places, and I have 4 pictures of women's haircuts in various lengths. Short, long, longer, longest, right? And I do the same thing with the men. Short, right? Short, long, right? And then underneath that on the PowerPoint, I ask the question, which one's the Church of Christ haircut? Right? And that usually gets people to, well, there really isn't a Church of Christ haircut. And you know what the answer to that is? You're right. There's not. So, to even look at verse 14, does even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair? The question is, what is meant by nature there? Because it's not born that way. It's what's the practice? And practices change. Now, 75 years ago, it may have been one thing. But 75 years from now, it's probably going to be different. Now, some things are commanded, but some things there are liberties about, there are customs about, and such things as that. So there has to be a recognition of that. Go ahead, Jim.
I had a lady work for me, and her son-in-law, really nice guy, but he long hair. And we got into quite a bit of discussion about it. And my conclusion was to them, it probably didn't prove a point, but said if you see a person from the back and their hair is sufficiently long that you can't tell if it's a man or a woman, if it's a woman, that's fine. But turn around, if it's a man, it's too long.
And that's your view. It's not everybody's view, though. How long was Jesus' hair?
Yeah.
They've seen the TV show. How long is it in the TV show? Do you think Jesus' hair, Jesus from Nazareth, right? How long was? Paul takes a vow at one point, and what is he not going to do? He's not going to cut his hair. So how long did Paul's hair get? I don't know. But he made that vow. Was that okay for him to make that vow? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
Wanted to say it's sad beyond words that some of the best people on God's earth are so confused over such a simple matter, over 1 Corinthians 11, 1 through 16. You take all these doctrines and put them together and boil them down. That's what you've got is some of our brethren want to get all the sisters partially covered in the whole of public worship throughout the world. And if they don't do that, they're going to be lost. Well, nothing is farther from the truth. That's not a matter of faith there. That's like you said, liberties. That's custom. There's about 4 places in our shows that he's referring to custom. Verse 6 right there, where it talks about if it be shameful. If it's a matter of faith, you ain't no ifs, ands, and buts about it. You do it or you're sin. And come on down to about verse 13, judge among yourselves. If it's a matter of law and a matter of faith, it's not left a judgment. You either do it or you're condemned. Verse 14 you mentioned there. Nature itself teach you. Well, we need to find out what nature is and what it's not. Nature is not God. It's not Christ. It's not the Holy Spirit. It's not the apostles. It's not the angels. Well, what's left there? Nature is second nature. Robertson defines that there. Nature is a natural feeling of decorum, a native sense of propriety in respect to customs in which a woman is born and reared. So it's second nature. Nature teaches you, that's that custom he's talking about there. And as Paul settles it for eternity in verse 16. Yep. If anybody's contentious about this, that's the apostles. The truth came through the apostles. We have no such custom, neither the churches of God. Right. And that's pretty simple. If we'll take that, when brethren teach that and bind it on women a partial head covering, they're teaching error. And the Lord's people shouldn't support the brethren that believe and teach that, because that's error. And when we support that, we're helping support error. So we should take that under consideration and take it to heart and really think about that.
Yep. Cultures change. And if anybody thinks even remotely that, well, it doesn't affect us, We are, if we think that, we are so wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. When I came and tried out here, if I wouldn't have worn a suit, what do you think? Think the church would have hired me? If I would have worn jeans and a polo, what do you think? But we got it all figured out, right? What do you think? Women and pants or dresses on Sunday? What do you think? You know what? I know what was actually taught in Columbus years ago. Fellas, when you get up, if your suit is not buttoned, then that means it's immodest. You need to button your suit. Right? But it can't happen to us, right? It can happen to us. Ultimately, what's the answer? Esteem others better than yourself. If something's a liberty, respect the liberty. Love one another. Love one another. Make sure things are done decently and in order. In matters of liberty, we consider the other one's conscience. But also, if we are convicted about something, what should we do? If we're convicted to do something, then we should do it. If we don't do it, then we're breaking our conscience. So, for example, I have known women who wore the covering out of conviction. In reading the same passage we read, they took the view to wear it, and they wore it. Is that okay? We had someone here, a month ago, who wore a covering and took the Lord's Supper with us. Is that okay? Yes. Are we going to bind what God has not bound? No. But is it a liberty? And that person may not realize it's a liberty. They might not understand this passage. You may ask them and they may think, I don't understand this passage. Whatever the case may be. If you have faith about it, what do? Keep it to yourself in this matter. Doesn't mean that you can't talk about it. Doesn't mean that we can't admonish one another and talk about it, stuff like that. Anyway, we'll go and stop there. I think just quickly, what sort of customs involving attire can be found in societies today? Right? That's my wedding ring. That's a custom. Is that a custom everywhere in the world? Is that a custom among some people? It's not a custom amongst everybody. Was it a custom all through time? No. Customs change. My point is that's a custom that involves something outward. You might think about other ideas. There are other cultural practices involving attire that can be found. Go ahead, Brace. We're in overtime.
The point you just made about a wedding ring. Interestingly enough, in the logo, they wear their wedding ring on the right ring.
That's so wrong.
To wear it on your left is, at least it was at the time that I was going, indicated that you were divorced. So,
Yep.
that's a custom of the land.
Yeah, we may talk more about that. Just different customs. Different people have, different countries have different practices. And we recognize that, and that's okay. That's fine.